fear this. We fear that they have something else that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why do you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Good day and welcome to Varn blog. And I will begin with mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. A good commentator always takes responsibility for his mistakes. And mine was perhaps that I put too much enthusiasm behind Zelensky souring on NATO. While German sources, like Tagesschau, have said that increasingly Zelensky is even willing to agree to neutralization, and it does seem like the commitment to NATO is beginning to wane. There was no ability to broker a ceasefire or passage for civilians. And thus, once again, things are scuttled. No assassination needed. The events may be from a lot of things. A lot of you have pointed out that I perhaps underestimated that the Azov, Adar, Defner, and other battalions with right-wing or fascist sympathies have been integrated throughout the Ukrainian armed forces, that public sentiment in Ukraine would probably make an easy ceasefire hard, as well as public sentiment in Russia. While it would be egg on the West face for Zelensky to quit this early, you can already see him, Pataski, trying to paint it as a line where there's very few lines we won't cross, or we will cross, actually, to avoid war with Russia. Some people may take this as American weakness. Some people may take it as American strength. You will do with it what you will. Another fact that was pointed out to me is perhaps I was too damning of Yostakovich. Going back and reading some news articles that were difficult to find from 2014, a Twitter follower of mine found a Telegraph article talking about the historic for defeat for the EU as Ukraine returns to Kremlin's control, which was from the time just before Euromaidan. What it became clear was Yanukovych's offer was a compromise position between the EU and Russia, which Russia had even agreed to, offering a trilateral dialogue with the Ukraine. But of course, the EU rejected this, with the US and the EU together threatening, or at least hinting, that they might pull IMF loans and funds away from the Ukraine if it took finance from Russia, while Yanukovych made no commitment to a Eurasian Union. This put Yanukovych back into the Russian sphere, and what happened happened. You can attribute intentionality to the coup, you can attribute agency to the Ukrainian people, and both would probably be correct. In some ways, it's impossible to know. As far as people's arguments for either Russia or NATO, I've begun an outsider test. Is the argument you are making, would it be legitimate if you flip sides on conditions? And you might go, well, there's no way to equivocate contextual conditions. Fine, but still ask yourself, would you find the pretenses thin if a side you normally opposed did the same thing? Would you sound like a neoconservative for what you're advocating Russia justification for the war was if it came out of the US's mouth? Or does the US's justifications currently sound a lot like its justifications with Iraq? Those are the kinds of questions you should ask yourself. It's not a perfect test. It's not necessarily even a good test, but it's a test of seeing if you're just trying to ad hoc justify your priors. I am becoming reluctant to comment on this Ukrainian situation because it is becoming harder and harder to tell what good sources are. I have been relying largely on American media, reading it, knowing it has a bias. British media, knowing that it has so far, even more bellicose bias. Qatari media, such as Al Jazeera, and German media, such as Der Spiegel, or when someone sends me an article from a local German paper. And when I can, I read Spanish articles as well. There have been a lot of appeals lately that I've found very lazy. For example, the argument either that we're in a revolutionary defeatist situation, which, given that NATO has not yet even directly entered this war, and at best it is a proxy war with an aggressor that is not NATO, I fail to see how that is in play here. Furthermore, I think many understandings of the Zimmerwald left and Lenin's embrace of it do not apply now, and their analysis is somewhat thin. After all, the defeat of both imperial parties in the case of Russia versus Germany only worked because the rest of the imperial parties won. Now, you may say they were bourgeois imperial parties versus purely reactionary imperial ones, like the case of Germany and Russia. But imperialism is supposed to be imperialism. But regardless, it's not time to rehash 1917 yet again. We do not live in that time, and it is time to quit acting as we did. As if we did. Furthermore, the idea that you only need to criticize your own state or your own state's allies presupposes that you have, and your opinion has a lot of influence on that state, and that your stance towards other nations is not being watched by the world. And in the age of global social media, it for sure is. It is better to keep your mouth shut than to take a side that is boorish, bellicose, or wrong, or be traitorous and support causes that aid reactionary agendas within your own country. simple geopolitical analysis, which leftists are sometimes given to, with sob stories about this or that, children dying in Yemen, children dying in Palestine, are not necessarily helpful. And I say this as a person who's literally sat and taught children who ran from Yemen or who had lost family members in Palestine. I know their pain. I know the blank look they can sometimes have in their eyes. I wish it was as simple as an appeal to a collective, unearned, and brutal trauma. But it is not. Even when you seem to be neutral, how you phrase that neutrality matters. There's a lot of misconceptions going on right now as we are about to enter a sanctions war that may tip an already flagging economy over the brink. 8% inflation, gas prices going up even before this. We'll see what happens. And we shall all see. I was watching today Jason Miles's video over at This is Revolution about the history and development of our entertainment media and our news infotainment. And I was thinking about answering a question about Bonapartism. At first, those two things did not seem related, or even related to my mistakes yesterday. Although the end of my speech was that we should be wary as we enter into a period of history that very much believes more and more in great men, because in many ways it has given up. I've talked about Joseph Tainter's theory that in periods of hypercomplication and overabundant and competing elites, the public and the elites themselves will often rely on a singular man to seemingly simplify the situation. People think that I am making this appeal to efficiency, but it is not an efficiency I'm appealing to. It is the appearance of one, the appearance of simplicity, the appearance of a reduction of power and an ease of movement. But what one sees very quickly in these sporadic and decaying systems is perhaps that is not always the case. The new CEO cannot save the company, even if it can rebrand everything. And a lot of people's politics has merely come down to using academic jargon as effectively branding or identifying with this or that historical tendency as if you could resurrect it full cloth from the dead. I'm done with this. Right now, I would tell you anyone who appeals to what the left should do without defining what the left is and which left we're talking about is not someone you should trust. You should not trust someone who thinks that everything can be worked out from just discussing things, particularly things they have not spent their life thinking about and experiencing. We are talking about war. We are talking about starvation. We are not talking about influencers or parlor Stalinists or this or that media operation funded by this or that organization or government. I was talking to a friend this morning at work. I don't go into the office every day, but I went in today. And we were talking about how many snowflakes there were in America. And no, we weren't talking about liberals or conservatives, but that times were getting hard here and people were fragile and everyone had this autopilot narrative of decline in which they can blame on someone else as if that gave them control. but you do not have control. You do not have that much more control here than you do in any other country, despite your vote. After all, what binds a politician to the vote you gave them? Every 4 years, you get to change again? Well, that is maybe a net progress. It also has its own cost trade-off. Longtime insiders develop hubris and sclerosis and often paranoia. But a constant movement of people leads to a lack of skills, the inability of people to operate, and inconsistent dealings with who is actually making and controlling American or anyone's power. And this has led us outsourcing things more and more to the cabinet, to the deep state, to the administrative apparatus. And this is true not just in our public life, but also our private ones. We live in the age of a million managers. As if somehow the managers were actually in control. So mea culpa. One apologizes and admits one is wrong. Even if my analysis yesterday was dependent on the idea that it could all go up in flames. The world is too complicated for anyone to predict, even when one uses systemic analysis, and very much when one sees people who have emotional investments in one or another side. People may ask me, well, where's the Marxist analysis in this? If you want me to talk about capital flows, disruption of energy, the fact that I think Europe has actually benefited greatly from the U.S. running its defense while Russia provided it cheap fuel, and that it's made a lot of European social democracies and welfare republics avoid having to make hard decisions, then yes, I would tell you that. Everyone's avoided making hard decisions. But even the best of us right now in all this discussion can't stop trying to get a score out on the quote shit libs or this and that person we've argued in the past. And even today, people who are listening to this know that I am hinting at discussions I've had with other people and dialogues other people are having. I don't say what I say to win a point, because what point is there to win? The economic catastrophes that we were probably going to start to see soon anyway are going to continue rolling in. And I've heard almost no one apologize for how wrong they were on inflation or how wrong they were on this, that, and the other. Every liberal outlet 7 months ago was telling me this inflationary period would go no further than 5% and would be no longer than a few months. The world is too complicated for people to predict like this, and they should stop trying. As for me, I will say I've lost patience with everyone, particularly anyone speaking for the left as a whole. If the function of something is what it actually does, the function of the left has been to keep Democrats in power, and Democrats' function has been to resurrect a kind of foreign policy establishment previously owned by Republicans. The Republicans' function has to be to capture anti-war sentiment as much as it exists in the general population, to redirect it as anti-Chinese sentiment for their own agenda. All of them are nationalists in a time where nation states are harder, more brittle, and going to be weirder and weirder to run. But Tainter predicted all this half a decade ago. Our societies would get too complicated, and if we did not find ways to engage in self-regeneration and destruction without actually destroying lives, people, or economies, that we were likely to reach for strongmen for the seeming simplicity of that relation. And we were likely to let most of the institutions go without watch. And so while we've complained about inequality now in America for 12 years, inequality is as worse as it's ever been. We've complained about lack of medical access. We've complained about student loans. Whether they are PMC concerns or not, they will continue to be a drag on our economy. And if Biden lets the time bomb go off on them, well, what do we have? We've also seen that things are fraying and that everyone is on autopilot with their commentary, looking for whatever news, whatever source will confirm their view. I don't come here to confirm your or my view. I come here to confound it. Not because I don't want you to have the clarity of action, but because I want any clarity of action to be real. So anyone talking about left and right without talking about its content should be treated as someone trying to fool you. I've seen a lot of rhetorical exercises aimed at fools. Don't be a fool.